I'm Corey Proffitt-Boyd, and this is Say It Anyway.
Say it anyway with Corey Proffitt-Boyd. Say it anyway. Say it anyway with Corey Proffitt-Boyd. Say it anyway.
Welcome back to Say It Anyway. Thanks for joining me again. Before we get started, I want to mention something that's important to me. I'm not a counselor, therapist, or mental health professional. Everything I share on this podcast comes from my own life, my own experiences, and the lessons I've picked up along the way. My goal isn't to tell anyone what they should do or to offer professional advice. It's simply to have honest conversations that remind us we're probably not as alone as we sometimes feel. And if your thoughts ever become overwhelming or begin affecting your daily life, I truly encourage you to reach out to a qualified mental health professional. Asking for help isn't something to be embarrassed about. In fact, I think it's one of the strongest things a person can do. And now that we've talked about that, I have a question for you. Does anyone else's brain seem to have absolutely no concept of business hours? Because mine apparently didn't get the memo. During the day, everything seems pretty manageable. I'm answering emails, working on projects, talking to people, and doing all the ordinary things that make up a normal day for me. My mind stays busy enough that it generally cooperates. It knows there are things to accomplish, places to be, and responsibilities that deserve my attention. Then nighttime shows up. The house gets quiet, the lights are off, my body starts to get comfortable, and I'm thinking, this is it. I'm finally going to get some sleep. And that's exactly when my brain decides it's time to go into full-blown overdrive. Suddenly, it's bringing up things I haven't thought about in years. It reminds me of conversations that probably meant absolutely nothing to anyone else, but somehow earned permanent storage in my memory. It starts wondering whether I remembered to do something that I was supposed to do 3 days ago. Then, just to keep things interesting, it likes to imagine problems that don't even exist yet. By the time my head actually hits the pillow, I've somehow traveled into the past, visited the future, and returned to the present without ever leaving my bed. The funny thing is, I used to think I was just an overthinker, and maybe I am. But the older I've gotten, the more conversations I've had with people, and the more stories I've heard, the more I've realized this might be one of the most common human experiences that nobody really talks about. People will tell you they're tired, stressed, or that they've had a long week, but very few people say, "My brain just won't be quiet." Maybe we don't say it because it feels too personal. Maybe we think everyone else has somehow figured out how to turn their thoughts off at the end of the day. Or maybe we've just all gotten so used to carrying around busy minds that we've started believing it's just something we're supposed to keep to ourselves. But I don't think we have to. That's why I want to talk about it today. Not because I have all the answers. Trust me, I don't. But I do know this. Sometimes the greatest comfort isn't finding a solution. Sometimes it's discovering that somebody else has been quietly carrying the same thing. I've noticed my brain never really runs out of material. If you've ever hosted overnight guests, you know there's always that one person who says they're leaving, stands up, walks toward the door, grabs the doorknob, and then starts an entirely new conversation. 20 minutes later, they're still standing in the doorway. That's my brain, every single night. Just when I think we're finished for the day, it says, "Before we wrap this up, I'd like to revisit something you said in 2018. It makes me want to say, really? We're doing this now? And the things that surface are almost never important. It isn't reminding me where I left my car keys, and it isn't helping me remember somebody's birthday. It's usually something like memories that are embarrassing to us or times in life that we feel like we have no closure to. It's bizarre when you realize how much energy we spend trying to rewrite moments that no longer exist. I don't think our brains necessarily become busier at night. I think life simply becomes quieter. During the day, there's enough noise to drown out a lot of what we're carrying. We answer the phone, have conversations, fold laundry, drive to work, scroll through social media, or watch television. There's almost always something competing for our attention. Then, almost without warning, all of those distractions disappear. The quiet isn't creating our thoughts, it's revealing them. Maybe that's why a long drive alone sometimes feels emotional. Maybe that's why standing in a hot shower can suddenly bring back a memory you hadn't thought about in years. And maybe that's why some of our biggest realizations happen when we're mowing the yard or taking a walk or lying in bed staring at the ceiling. Those are the moments when life finally gets quiet enough for us to hear ourselves think. And sometimes what we hear surprises us. Not because the thoughts are new, but because they've been patiently waiting for us to slow down long enough to acknowledge that they've been there all along. I don't always enjoy them, but I've learned not to fear them either. Because sometimes buried underneath all the worry and all the replayed conversations is something that actually deserves our attention. Sometimes it's gratitude we've forgotten to notice. Sometimes it's grief we've been too busy to feel. Sometimes it's excitement about something we've convinced ourselves is unrealistic. And sometimes it's simply our minds asking us to slow down because we've been running on autopilot for far too long. The quiet can be uncomfortable, but every now and then it can also be incredibly honest. One thing I've realized about having a busy brain is that it's an incredible storyteller. The problem is that not every story it tells is true. Have you ever sent a text message, watched the little delivered notification appear, and then realized several hours had gone by without a reply? It's amazing how quickly our minds can fill in the blanks. We go from, they're probably busy, to wondering if we said something wrong, if they're upset with us, or if we've somehow damaged a relationship that was perfectly fine before we picked up the phone. The reality is often much less dramatic. Maybe they were in a meeting. Maybe they set their phone down. Maybe they read the message and genuinely meant to respond later but got distracted by life. We've all done it. Yet when it's our own message waiting for a reply, our brains become award-winning screenwriters, creating plot twists that don't exist and motivations we've completely invented. I've caught myself doing this more times than I can count, and every time I finally learn the truth, it's almost laughable how different reality was from the story I'd been telling myself. It serves as a reminder that our minds are incredibly creative, but creativity isn't the same thing as certainty. Sometimes our thoughts are simply trying to make sense of incomplete information, and in the absence of answers, they'll happily write their own ending. The challenge is remembering that just because our brains can imagine something doesn't mean it's necessarily happening. That doesn't make us foolish. It makes us human. Let's take a quick break, and when we come back, I want to talk about something that completely changed the way I look at a busy brain. Because what if it isn't always something to fight? What if sometimes it's simply evidence that you've lived, you've loved, you've worried, and you've cared? Let's talk about it right after a break for our sponsors. Welcome back to Say It Anyway. Thanks for sticking around. Today we're talking about something I think far more people experience than we admit out loud: a busy brain. In the first half of today's episode, we've talked about replaying old conversations, how quiet often reveals the thoughts we've been carrying all day, and how our minds have an incredible ability to write stories when we don't have all the information. But as I was thinking about this episode, I kept coming back to one question. What if we've been looking at a busy brain the wrong way? For a long time, I thought the goal was to make my mind stop thinking. I thought there must be people out there who could simply lay their head on the pillow at night, close their eyes, and drift off into the most peaceful night's sleep without a single thought crossing their minds. And if I'm being totally honest, I was a little jealous of those imaginary people. And then one day it occurred to me. I have absolutely no evidence those people even exist. Maybe all of us have busy minds. Maybe they just sound different from one person to the next. Whether people's worries are about their children, their aging parents, replaying conversations from the past, wondering if they're making the right career decision, or carrying grief that no one else can see. It all seems to point to the human mind trying its best to make sense of a complicated life. So I'm not so sure that I believe a busy brain automatically means something is wrong with us. Sometimes I think it simply means we've lived. A mind that's loved people will naturally think about those people. A mind that's experienced loss will revisit memories. A mind that's built a business, raised a family, cared for parents, survived disappointment, celebrated victories, and learned hard lessons isn't going to look the same as one that hasn't carried those experiences yet. So maybe our minds aren't trying to punish us. Maybe they're trying to organize a lifetime of moments that mattered. That doesn't mean every thought deserves our attention. It certainly doesn't mean every worry is true. But it does remind me that I'm not broken because my mind is active. I'm human, and there's something strangely comforting about that. I've also noticed that this can impact the way we speak to ourselves. We literally will speak to ourselves in ways we'd never dream of speaking to someone we love. If a close friend came to you and said, "My brain has just been so busy lately, I can't seem to slow it down," I doubt many of us would respond by saying, "Well, just quit thinking about it." We wouldn't do that. We'd sit with them, listen, and try to comfort them. We'd probably tell them they've been carrying a lot, remind them they're doing the best they can, and reassure them that they don't have to have everything figured out today. So why is it so difficult to extend that same kindness to ourselves? Why do we expect ourselves to navigate every challenge perfectly, make every decision confidently, and never question whether we're doing enough? Somewhere along the way, many of us adopted the idea that being hard on ourselves would somehow make us stronger. We criticize ourselves for worrying too much, for thinking too much, for caring too much, as though compassion toward ourselves is something that has to be earned. I've started wondering if maybe we have it backwards. Maybe giving ourselves a little grace doesn't make us weaker. Maybe it makes us healthier. Maybe it's okay to admit that some seasons of life require more patience than others. And maybe it's okay to acknowledge that some days our minds are simply carrying more than they can neatly organize before bedtime. That doesn't make us failures. It makes us people. Whatever you're doing today as you listen to this episode, I hope you'll hear this next part. You're probably carrying more than most people realize. Not because you're trying to hide it, but because that's what so many of us do. People say, "How are you?" and we say, "I'm doing fine," even when our thoughts have been running a marathon all day. We smile, show up, handle responsibilities, and even encourage other people. And all the while, there are conversations happening inside our own minds that no one else can hear. If that's you tonight, I hope you'll remember something. You don't have to solve every problem before you go to sleep. You don't have to replay every conversation until you've found the perfect response. You don't have to predict tomorrow in order to be ready for it. Sometimes it's enough just to recognize what's happening and remind yourself that your mind is doing what minds often do. If those thoughts become overwhelming, if they begin affecting your relationships, your work, sleep, or ability to enjoy life, I sincerely hope you'll reach out to a qualified mental health professional. There's tremendous courage in asking for help, and no one should feel like they have to carry that weight alone. Before we wrap up today, I want to leave you with one final thought. I don't think peace comes from never having another busy thought. I think it comes from realizing that we don't have to believe every thought our minds offer us, and we don't have to be afraid of every quiet moment either. The truth is, life is complicated. People are complicated, and our minds are complicated. So, maybe expecting them to be perfectly quiet all the time isn't realistic. Maybe what is realistic is learning to meet ourselves with a little more understanding than criticism. If this episode found you on a day when your brain has been especially busy, I hope it's reminded you that you're not the only one. And if your mind happens to be quiet today, maybe send this episode to someone who comes to mind. You never know what someone else might be carrying behind a smile or a simple, "I'm okay." Together with Say It Anyway, You're helping build a community where honesty is welcomed and where people can feel a little less alone. Thanks so much for joining me again for this episode of Say It Anyway. I'm Corey Proffitt-Boyd, and until next time, say it anyway.
Say it anyway with Corey Proffitt-Boyd. Say it anyway. Say it anyway with Corey Proffitt-Boyd.